Hi guys, sorry, we're going to start on page 9. That Screencastify only lets me record for so long. All right, so if you're on page 9, this is the second part of our notes. So we're looking at function notation. And remember, I was just talking about how function notation is actually f of x is equal to y. So we're going to look at the first question. Describe what each part of the function notation stands for. So for example, in t parenthesis 2 equals 70, what does each part represent? So if you are taking notes right now, you want to pick up your pencil. T is going to be our total cost. 2 is the number of swimsuits that they ordered. 70 is our total price. So take a look here. If we looked back at the graph, and I'm just going to write on my screen. If we look back at the graph, we actually had the ordered pair 2, 70, right? 2 was the number of swimsuits, the x variable. Well, take a look. This 2 was actually transplanted right here where x is. And then the 70, that total price, we took and we put in the outside of the function where y is. That's how we came up with t of 2 is equal to 70. So if we take a look at number 2 now, t of 4 equals 110. Well, what does that mean in words? That's simply going to show us that the total cost of ordering 4 swimsuits is $110. T of 6 equals 150 is going to be the total cost of ordering 6 swimsuits is $150. And then we're going to take and we're going to reverse that. And instead of writing it in words, we're going to take the words and put it into our function notation. So the total cost of ordering 8 swimsuits, I know that this 8 is going to replace, this 8 right here is going to replace X. And I know that the 190, excuse me, is going to replace Y. So in your notes, go ahead and write T of 8 equals 190. For letter B, the total cost of ordering 1 swimsuit, again, think to yourself, what does that 1 represent? That's our independent variable, that's our X. What does the 50 represent? That's our Y. So the total cost of ordering 1 swimsuit is going to be T of 1, or T parentheses 1, equals 50. All right, so moving right along, and if you need to, you can always pause me, get written down what you need to write, and then start it up again. On the next page, we are actually going to take a look. This should be in your book on page 10, but what is function notation? This is our generic name for the function. So the whole symbol represents that output, and the X represents the input. So we're going to actually use these 3 tables, F of X, G of R, and K of S. So if I wanted to replace it, what our function notation is telling us is that f of x really represents the y value, whereas the x, the r, and the s, that represents our x value. So I'm just going to put the x up top and the y at the bottom. And I'm going to do that in all 3 places to remind you. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about ordered pairs. Okay? So f of -1, how do I go ahead and solve that? That's telling me, remember that value when x is -1. So I'm going to come up here to the x and f of x, that first table, and I'm going to take a look. Where is x -1? So I come to the x value, I look at the -1, and then I'm going to take a look, and I'm just going to circle it here so you can see this. Here's where my value of x is -1. And what I'm being asked is, what is that y value? So to solve this, or to write it out, I literally just type or write out f of -1 is equal to -6, because you can see when the input is -1, the output, or what's coming out of it, that whole output value is -6. For g of r equals 7, this is a little bit different. Number 2 is looking at it backwards. It's saying when you plug in what number, like what x, will your output be 7? So again, I'm going to come over to that second table, and I'm going to take a look. Where is the output 7? So if I'm looking, I should see that my output is 7 right here. Okay, so again, I'm looking at this part of my table. I know that the output is 7 when I input a 3 for r. So the way I'm going to write that in notation is going to be g of 3 is equal to 7. The input is 3. The output in this case is 7. So when it's written like it is in number 1 or in number 3, I'm telling you what to input. So K of 3 means put 3 in for that X value. When you see it like number 2 or like number 4, this is telling you the output is 7, and I want to know, what did you input? What X value did you put in to get a 7 out? So in this case, and you might want to pause to see if you can get these right on your own. But in this case, when I plug 3 in, I'm going to look over here at my K of S chart. When I plug 3 in for S, I'm going to look over here and I'm going to find that that is right here. When I plug in 3 for X or for S, what am I getting out? I should be getting out a 9. So K of 3 is equal to 9. And finally, for K of S being equal to 5, I'll go ahead and switch to purple. My output value this time has to be 5. So I know I'm going to look at this value right here, the 5. What is my input? Well, in order to get out 5, I need to put in a 2. So for this one, K of 2 is equal to 5. All right, you are going to go ahead and you're going to try some on your own. So it's time to practice. Right before we get to the practice, there's something that I like to remember. I use it all the time. I probably learned it when I was like in 8th grade in algebra, but it's called Dixieroid. It's just a mnemonic device to help you remember. The Dixie, the left side of the table that you're looking at, this stands for everything having to do with our X value. And you can see that D stands for the domain. The domain is all of our X terms. I stands for the input. That X value is what we're putting into the function. The X also stands for the X variable. And finally, that last I in Dixie stands for independent. So these are all synonyms, kind of, for what we know X to represent. So X is always the independent variable. It's always the input in your function. It's always the X variable in your ordered pair. It's always the domain of whatever graph you have. So that's what the Dixie stands for. The roid part is everything. So you guessed it. If Dixie was X and it's right here in the word Dixie, then roid is going to be everything associated with the Y value. So the R stands for range. So instead of being the domain of that graph, the range of our graph is when we look north and south. It's when we look at all those Y values. The O stands for the output. So if the X is what we're putting in, the O is what we're getting out. And the Y value is always that answer. That's what's coming out of our function. The Y stands for the Y variable, and the D stands for Y being independent. For being dependent. So the Y variable is the dependent variable in the situation, hence Dixieroid. If you remember Dixieroid, you will never confuse the two. I promise you I'm way older than you, and I still use this to help myself out. All right, so now that we've gotten through that, it is going to be your chance to practice. So go ahead and pause me for a minute and take a look at page 10. And when you come back, when you unpause, you'll be able to see all of the answers. So I'm going to head and I'm going to move on now. Here are my answers for all of page 10, and I'm literally just going to move these boxes out of the way. If you have questions about any of these, go back a couple of minutes and watch the last part of that video on when I was explaining what the input versus the output, but you should have similar answers to all of the questions here on page 10. So again, you can pause if you want to check through your work, but I am going to move on. The next page is something, this is page 11 in your packet. We can also use a graph to show our function. So we've given you 3 graphs, f of x, g of x, and h of x. These are 3 different function graphs, and they work the same way that the table does. So if you think back to yesterday's video, when we watched how to take those functions and put them into a function table and then a graph, we're doing the same thing here. But here I'm going to use the graph to figure out the ordered pairs so I can put it back into function notation. So when it asks me to find g of -4, that's telling me the input value on this g graph is -4. So I come over here to g and I come over to -4, which is right here. And then I take a look and I come down on my graph and I find this ordered pair. So when I input a -4, what is my output? My output is -3. So to write this, g of -4 is equal to -3. All right, I'm running out of time again, so I'm going to start a third video.